Thank you very much for joining our session today, where we're taking a deep dive into the 2024 Reading SATs paper. With me today is Heather March, who is Director of Teaching and Learning at Aim High Academy Trust. And I'm Claire Freeman from Reading Solutions UK. I'm a Reading Development Consultant and Head of Research. So today we're going to have a little bit of a look at the national reactions to this year's Reading SATs paper compared to 2023. We're going to have a little look at the results from our survey, which focused on the paper's difficulty, fairness and overall effectiveness. We're going to have a chat with Heather about her own trust's experience and the experience with the 2024 SATs paper compared to the previous years. And then we're going to have a little chat about some of the strategies that we shared in preparing for the SATs webinar that we did earlier in the year, and see how that helped prepare the pupils for the SATs paper, and make some suggestions for future preparation as well. Great. We'll be taking around about 45 minutes, and if you do have any questions at any point, please feel free to put them in the chat box and we can answer them as soon as we get a minute. So, what are your thoughts then, Heather? In terms of the SATs text and styles of text, what did you think about it this year as a general overview?
Yeah, so initial impressions were, and this was shared by the Year 6 teachers across the trust really, initial impressions were pretty similar to last year in terms of complexity, but all felt the surprise with that initial non-fiction text. All felt that now we've had a bit more time to look at it since they've been released. And that's the first time we've seen where we've got the non-fiction and the two narratives. So that was certainly something that was thrown up. Every year for the past few years, I've been saying maybe there'll be a poem again, but yet again, there was no poem, no poetry. But first impressions were on the whole similar to last year, but not harder than last year, but it had its own kind of tricky areas in slightly different ways, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. That's certainly some of the feedback I've heard. In terms of question level analysis then around the points available for each domain, what were your thoughts around that?
So again, looking at it in more detail since it's been released, but very, very heavy again, inference and retrieval, as it always is. And looking at it, that's fairly similar to last year's balance, pretty similar. Not a great deal of vocabulary questions, although we felt the vocabulary within the reading booklets was very tricky. And certainly one of the things that was thrown up was the vocabulary in that first text was tricky for the children. And of course, looking at the content domains, it's all around that inference and retrieval, and a lot of content domains which aren't questioned upon at all. But in terms of the complexity of the questioning, probably fairly similar to last year. There was 3 questions, I think, where they had to look at the whole text, not just a part of the text. So that's something which we'll come on to later in terms of how to approach that and how to talk to the children about that. So obviously, most of the questions were still directing them to look at this section, look at this paragraph beginning. But there were 3 questions, I think, where it was like, look at the whole text before they could answer those questions. In terms of getting through the questions, staff felt as well that it was similar to last year in terms of very tight for time. Getting through them was hard work in terms of stamina and resilience. But in terms of getting probably the pace similar to last year's, like struggling to just get finished or perhaps miss a question or two, even for those children who are pretty good readers.
No, definitely. I think some of the surprises for you absolutely were around the informational text as the first text. I think that will have put an awful lot of pupils on the back foot.
We felt that. We felt it through a lot of the children, because straight away, well, I'd never heard of a tenrec. I'd never heard of one. And so afterwards I had to find out, actually, is it a real animal? Which it is. And stridulation. So I think straight away by throwing in a text where I mean, there's often an animal-based non-information text, but it's always been an animal they've heard of. So
Yeah.
I thought that was sneaky and tricky. I think that did put them on the back foot, and they had to work really hard to overcome that, a lot of them, because straight away that could have created panic mode, or my goodness, the first text, and here's a term I've never heard of before. So yeah,
Yeah.
I
And
think
the
that
quantity of, sorry, the quantity of inference questions actually in that text, there were 6 marks and 9 marks for retrieval. It's a really high proportion of inference questions for a first text.
first text. Yeah, because that's often what we taught the children about that. Well, historically, but we might have to talk about this differently now. But historically, we've spoken to the children about the fact that that first text is going to be more accessible. It's often a narrative which might have slightly more of a relatable context. It doesn't usually have vocabulary that's going to be unknown to the children in the first text. It's something that they're usually very familiar with in terms of vocab. So yes, the complexity of that one. So the complexity overall, staff felt was comparable, but they did feel the complexity of the first one was higher than a typical first text. Definitely, that's the thoughts.
But then they didn't really get any reprieve in the second text either, with again, the majority of marks in that text were inference based.
Yeah, and some tricky, sneaky ones in there as well.
Some very, very, very tricky style questioning, I think.
Yeah, there was one which stood out to me where, the second text, where they had to order what she did getting up on the tightrope, and it was that inference around, she got a bird's eye view of his head, and for them to be able to infer that she looked down before she looked up. There was some pretty tricky questions in there, for them to really unpick that, to really think about in a very short space of time.
And although there was lots of complexities with the final text, it actually had the least amount of inference questions, and we'd normally expect to see the most amount of inference style questions in that text. So I think certainly with our understanding of what we'd normally expect to see in a SATs paper, it kind of threw out lots of wormholes for the pupils to go down, I think.
Yeah, I think will change the conversation slightly with children. Absolutely agree, because usually you'd expect the last text to be a context that they're not familiar with, that they can't relate to, full of more challenging vocabulary. Certainly you would assume that that's where all the inference, or most of the inference, is going to be. But yeah, you're right. So I think that's why teachers felt overall it had a similar feel to last year, but the way it was laid out was very, very different. Very different.
And how about the number of words?
So it was overall 100 less than last year, wasn't it? So number of words, pretty comparable again to last year, I suppose. It's not which year was it, 2019, that it was particularly low. There was but yeah, only 100 words less than last year, and everybody last year felt it was very, very, very wordy and a lot to get through. So we're still seeing that. Absolutely. And having that kind of 3-page narrative for the second text as well. A lot of reading, a lot to get through. So still very, very heavy on sheer amount of words, and the kind of the implications that has then for stamina and fluency is going to continue to be a huge focus.
Most definitely. And something I picked up on as well is particularly the final text, although there was less inference style questions in it, in terms of the layout of how it looked on the page. It was very, like, a big block of text. It wasn't segmented very well and stuff like that. There wasn't really subheadings. And actually one of the sentences within that text was 39 words.
Yeah.
So that in itself is telling us that the Lexile range is going to be a challenge on the Lexile range. We'll do some more studies on that to find out exactly what the Lexile ranges were. But it's certainly really challenging how they navigated it. The first 2 texts were broken down into subheadings a little bit more.
More accessible.
Yeah.
More accessible chunks. But yeah, I think that, again, that's those implications, isn't it? Making sure that, well, throughout Key Stage 2, but particularly upper Key Stage 2, that they have massive exposure to complex texts and complex sentence structure, that they have to be not fazed by text like that, with a wide range of complex sentence structures in there. Yeah
definitely. So what I wouldn't mind doing is finding out about what your experiences have been in terms of the anecdotes from your children and anecdotes from any
Yeah.
staff, any colleagues that you've spoken to.
Yeah.
And similarly, if any of you listening have got any anecdotes or feedback they would like to share with us, please do pop them in the chat box.
Yeah. Well, certainly on the day itself, getting that kind of anecdotal pupil voice feedback on the day from some of the children. And actually the children across our schools were incredibly resilient. And actually on the whole, there was one or two wobbles, but on the whole, across the whole trust, they accessed it really, really, really well. And for the reading test, the particular school I was in for that day, I kind of dropped in and observed a group work and who were some children who were kind of would find it more challenging, but they gave it a fantastic go. And I think what's helped there is they've done a lot of practice around like the timings of the tests, and they were really thinking about it in those 20-minute chunks, which was really hard. So the first text, they really had to push themselves to get through it in the 20 minutes. But actually on the whole, they did. There was only a handful of children who were disappointed that they hadn't managed to quite get finished. But I think, that's kind of a testament to the teaching staff and what's been put in place, that they were well prepared. They did access it, and they did do a really, really, really good job. Hard to know until the results come out, but the children weren't, the kind of the resilient, and they've bounced back, and they haven't totally been and speaking to them, they were like, yeah, it was okay. They were like, yeah, it was tricky. And they certainly found that first text a little bit tricky, but they could give it a go. I would say that was the similar attitude of my son as well. He was like, yeah, it was okay, was his response. The teaching staff across the schools all said very, very similar, that the first text was like, oh, that's a tricky one through them, but the children were resilient, seemed calm, seemed okay. For those children who needed it, the rest breaks were beneficial, giving them those rest breaks at 20-minute intervals to try and keep them really, really focused and really sharp on what kind of ultimately what their aim was, of giving them those targets to try and in practice test to get to that point after a certain time. So teachers were very impressed with the children's attitude and resilience, but it was very much a common picture across the 3 schools, really.
Yeah, fabulous. When we spoke earlier, you mentioned something about how the questions were a little bit confusing, particularly the one about the Tenricks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Social animals.
Yes. So some of them, observing some of the children, another question which stood out was about how do we know that Tenrecs are social animals? Well, I think a lot of our children might have said, as stated in the text, we are told that they are social animals, because it actually said that. And I think whereas obviously that isn't allowed in the mark scheme, and they had to read round it and think, well, it's the fact that they want to be in family groups and they don't live alone. But I'm wondering when it comes back whether a lot of our children might have been caught out by that, because it's actually stated that. I also think some of them may have found it tricky, the one where they had to join the features of the Tenrec to other types of animals, because a lot of it was in one section of the text, but then there was the bit about the crickets making the sound like a cricket was on the other side of the page. So I think some of them were getting a bit muddled there. Some of them I think might have made the leap from the snout being like part of a hedgehog rather than the bird. So yeah, they gave it a really good shot, but I think there was some where they might just have missed out on the marks because of the complexity of the word and of the questions.
Yeah.
And they might have left feeling quite confident, but I just wonder, is how, looking at the mark scheme, will some of them actually lost a few marks just because of the complexity of that, and like you say, how heavy it was on the inference and the first text, and how specific they've got to be with some of their answers as well. Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Yeah. So although they answered everything in that first text, yeah, it's that. Yeah.
What I'd like to do now is just give you a little bit of an insight as to some of the information that's come through from our Reading Solutions UK survey that we conducted straight after SATs. And so we asked we asked whether the people felt it was harder or easier or about the same. And so what we found was that 33% felt that the paper was harder and 48% said it was about the same. So we believe that last year's paper was perceived to be the hardest since 2016. So if you're thinking it's even harder than that, then it's going to have been a challenge for the pupils. Other feedback that we've had is that same as last year, the test was awful too. 2023-24, it was harder than many previous papers. We've also had the last text made my most confident student cry. She aced her 11 plus and was broken by her SATs today. She has never not understood the text, and today she was a shell. God love them. It's terrible to hear, isn't it? Have you had anything like that come across? Have you come across anything like that, Heather, or is it been like
I have like previous experience, and I think sometimes you find that with those really able students who put so much pressure on themselves sometimes, don't they? I don't think that doesn't come from staff and teachers. I think sometimes you just come across those children who need that nurture because they put that pressure on themselves. But I think it can be very, very overwhelming. And I do think that about having an hour to access those 3 texts and answer all those questions. So when I keep talking about like resilience and stamina, that is a massive, massive thing, because it's that panic that sets in for some children as well, who really, really care and really put that pressure upon themselves. And I can see how that could happen, because especially if they're conscious of the time, which of course there will be. So we didn't have anybody this year like that, but we did have a couple of years ago. We had a very actually, was it like 2 years ago? So it was when it was 2022, the 2022 one. A really, really able little boy just had a complete meltdown when he first opened it and had a panic. So what we did, we completely removed him out of the situation, just took him out, kept him away from the other children. The head teacher actually like fed him chocolate and told him jokes and just like really calmed him down. The other children continued, and he was in a completely separate room, 2 members of staff. And then when he felt ready, he did it by himself before he'd had any contact with the other students, because he would have just sat there. He'd gone into panic attack mode.
Oh,
so there was absolutely no point in him doing it then. But within an hour later, he was on doing it, and he absolutely smashed it.
Oh,
But of course, that's if you've got the staff to do that. And that was easy enough for us to do, because it happened right at the start as soon as you opened it. So we're like, pause the time, right? Just come out. There's no point in there crying for an hour and not doing it at all. So I have witnessed it in different guises, and it is just trying to have those contingency plans. Sometimes if someone has a meltdown at the beginning, can we get them out of the situation and give them a break? And because as long as they're not in contact with the other children and the time's paused, that's absolutely fine, as long as it's completed in that day, in that time frame. And then that worked. For him, and he was a great adept child. But if he'd sat there from the beginning and tried to do it, he would absolutely not have got what he deserved. But then, of course, that can be fed back to the secondary schools, that this child's had a really bad time on the test, but it's not reflective of who they are at all. And I think let the children know that if they're a really able child and we know what they're like, we need to reassure them that does not affect their secondary school career at all.
No, not at all. Everything's movable in secondary, within first term, they're adjusting, sitting and things like that. They'll be fine with it.
That's awful. Yeah, we don't want to see children broken and upset by a test.
Some other feedback we've had is that 42% said the texts were more complex and 48% said the vocabulary was more complex. So I think that certainly the main feedback that we've, in terms of the anecdotal feedback, was that the language used was much more complex and not appropriate for all children. Lots of children struggling with all 3 texts, like as you've just said. Another comment was that the complexity of the questions was the main challenge yet again. Some questions were so ludicrous. Ludicrously worded. That's how funny to say, stumble on that word. who just reworded that. It was hard to get to the nub of what was actually required, and I think we highlighted that earlier on in terms of not being able to just state what was said in the paper. Another comment has been like 46% of tests were less relatable in regard to students' cultural capital. I really have a concern about this because it's so many children have no idea what we're talking about in terms of TENREX. I mean, most adults didn't have any idea about.
Well, like I say, I hold my hands up. I'd never heard of one before.
And it's just not relatable for an awful lot of pupils. So a comment was in terms of cultural capital, our cohort and children within in the group won't have had any experience of some of the concepts. It bore no interest to my children and did not show fairness in capital cultural experiences. And the papers are more and more aimed at middle class white children. What are your thoughts on that, Heather?
I think they often have been. I think that's often been the feel, but I completely agree with the whole relatable aspect, because I always in the past have felt that at least the first text has often been a narrative that they can have some understanding of. 2 years ago with the football trip, and at least that's like within their kind of understanding. The camping one last year, yes, I haven't been camping. We do take our children on a camping residential, so a lot of children in our trust certainly have an understanding of a camping trip. So again, that's relatable. It's not something they haven't heard of. I think we often expect the last text to be a bit more abstract. We expect that text to be more challenging and less relatable, I think, over the years. But yeah, I agree. I think the 3 texts, you could argue, weren't particularly relatable. Yes, some children may have been to a circus, but some may not. So yeah, there wasn't one text where you thought, oh, every child will have had experience or an understanding of that. Yeah, so I think this is the first time where I felt every single text was a bit more unrelatable. Yeah,
I'd agree with you. Additional feedback that we've had, we've pretty much touched on it already, was that there was too many inference questions and the text was too long to complete in the time limit. Is there anything further that you would like to add to that, or have we covered it up?
Yeah, I agree. Time is very tight, and I do often think that I think an hour for the reading paper. I know my thoughts on this isn't going to change anything, but I often find that the grammar paper is certainly far more accessible and fairer in terms of time. Because you've got 45 minutes, and I always feel that the children with those questions have plenty of time to do them and a little bit of time for checking. Whereas the reading paper, I just think the structure isn't right. I don't know what the answer is, but maybe 2 separate papers, maybe one 40-minute paper, a 45-minute paper, and one half-an-hour paper. Just, I feel like it's a lot of cognitive overload in an hour for an 11-year-old to race through. It's my personal thought. But I can't see that changing. So we do have to prepare our children that it is going to be an hour of intense reading. They can't really switch off for a minute.
No, they haven't got the capacity for an extra minute, have they?
No.
So I'm just seeing that Chris is saying, Chris Best, that he's agreeing with everything so far, and we've got a thumbs up. So it's good to know that your experiences have been similar to other people's.
Yeah, it is. The more schools you talk to, it does seem to be fairly common feeling. Yeah.
So when we last spoke on our last webinar, Heather, we talked about how we prepared the pupils ready for SATs. There's a couple of questions I wouldn't mind looking at. So firstly, how did it work? Did it help the children? Do you feel like all the strategies that you put in place were of value to them when it came to the day? And then secondly, what would you do differently based on the experiences this year with it being such a different test? What are there any other strategies that you could put in place, or you could advise everybody about and how you're going to tackle it for next year?
Yeah, definitely. So I did some staff voice with our year 6 teachers just earlier this week, actually, and to think about what's worked well this year in the lead up and have those strategies worked. And we absolutely, agree that having specific whole class reading lessons daily, or at least a few times a week, absolutely makes a difference. So separate to the English lesson, having specific reading lessons where we look at different extracts, text types, think about using the questioning styles from the SATs. So that's something Year 6 teachers feel very strongly do help. So when they're asking children the questions, they're not just kind of simple question answer questions, but matching questions, true or false questions, questions in table formats. So giving children lots of kind of experience of all the different question types. So whole class reading lessons can't be, that they are so important. They absolutely need to be part of the curriculum. The use of Reading Plus has absolutely had an impact. Thinking about one school in particular, which I mentioned on our last chat, the way they were prepared for the test by having Reading Plus in Year 5 for that whole year, and then some of them taking it into Year 6 who still needed it, massively helped. And I've mentioned this to you before about my son as well with Reading Plus, who's not a natural reader for pleasure, but so he's used Reading Plus in his school for a year as well. And looking at those children who are at least a D, and certainly if they're at level E, F, G, H, I, we've got children working at those levels as well, you can say with absolute certainty that they are not going to come across anything in the SATs paper that's any more complex than that. So if they're working at E or above, you know for a fact that they are reading very complex texts. When you were talking about the Lexiles, they are going to be getting really complex sentence structures and a wide range of questions. So that's something which will absolutely continue next year as well. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment actually as well. Thinking about the vocabulary as well, when staff are planning their whole class reading lessons, they've said it's been very beneficial to make sure that they're looking for extracts which have complex vocabulary within there, trying to use texts and extracts where words will be unfamiliar to the children, just that exposure. And of course, you can never predict what words are going to be thrown up. So, I don't think anyone used an extract this year with stridulation in it. But trying to make sure that they're not fazed by new words being thrown at them within an extract or a text, because they can read around it. And that kind of thinking about what we would do differently for this year, I would certainly talk to the Year 6 teachers about, and then I know they will use that TENREC text as an example in their teaching next year to say, right, don't be put off by a text. If it's an unfamiliar word, actually we'll just read it. That doesn't matter to the meaning once you get past it. So really talking to them and discussing the importance of not being fazed by something like that. And of course, within the test, they don't have access to dictionaries, or they can't ask what a word means. So they've got to be confident enough to know that doesn't matter. I can read around it. I can read the rest of it. And that word then will hopefully make sense. Because actually you didn't need to know what a TENREC was to understand that text. And it explained what stridulation was, if I'm saying that correctly. So it's about lots and lots of exposure to that. And it's all, when I think about the whole class reading lessons and what we need to really think about, the reading framework really advises that when we do reading lessons, we absolutely have to think about all of the content domains. And we do, and I agree with that. We need to make children rounded readers, and they need to draw on all their skills. But I think we can still do that whilst also discreetly teaching them what those skills are and giving them that language so that they can apply many of those skills all at the same time. And I think you can also have that conversation with them about the fact in the SATs paper, it's going to be mainly inference, retrieval, and a little bit of vocabulary. So when you're throwing up the question types on the board or in front of them, having a discussion sometimes with just, right, let's take a moment and think about what kind of question it is. And I know our teachers do that a lot. There's loads of conversations. So the children are like, oh yeah, it's an inference question. It's not going to tell me exactly what it is. It's retrieval. I just have to go in and get it. So that will be something that will be continued next year. Looking at all of the content domains, but really having that your mind on the fact that they are going to be questioned on these ones in particular. But it's about getting the balance, isn't it? You can't go you don't want to teach to the tests.
Yeah, it's making them a
Well,
whole reader, isn't it? So they're
yeah,
ready for
that's really
when they go
important.
to
Yeah,
secondary school and all the different styles and of questioning they're going to get
yeah.
there, GCSE, but also knowledgeable that this is where we're mostly testing. It's a big
Yeah,
time balance, isn't it?
I think year six children can have those conversations, and if you involve them in that discussion, then they're not phased and they become more confident with the styles of questions that they'll come across. And I think those conversations need to start in year five as well, within the whole class reading lessons, about which I know they do, and even further down in Key Stage 2 about the types of questions that they're looking at and the types of questions that they're answering. Another thing I've really thought about in the past couple of weeks is our use of Reading Plus as well. So I was saying there about the fact that I know for a fact using it in year five has had a significant impact. So what I've done is really looked at our year five children and the ones who were already at a D or an E or above, to allow to inform staff and inform next year's teachers that these children are already reading really complex texts. But then looking at the ones who aren't far away, because I think in the next 6 weeks, this half term, I've advised the year five teachers to have a massive, massive push, because in 6 weeks with Reading Plus, you can make huge gains. You can make a big thing of it in terms of motivation, using the leaderboard to really enthuse them and engage them. And then it just means that they're going to hit the ground running more in September, and they'll be able to see which children are going to continue with it. Is it then going to be moved to the new year fives? And it's got that flexibility to do that. So we're not just thinking about September, we're thinking about actually this half term with our year fives as a way of just getting them to read increasingly complex texts in a way which is really, really engaging. And they don't know that's preparing them for SATs. But it's beneficial all round to have a real push on that in the next 6 weeks, definitely.
It can be such a pivotal term, that half term this for year fives. They
Yeah,
can
definitely.
make really great progress in this last half term, but also thinking about potential like summer challenges and things like that to keep them motivated, engaged in reading. Have you got any
Definitely.
plans for anything like that?
I think that's a really good idea. And we do often say, there's a lot of we often get a lot of emails through about the summer reading challenges. Lots of different companies like run them and provide them, and online challenges. Local libraries have done things like that with us in the past as well. So we do try to engage with as many of those as we can, and encourage them to keep up their reading. Because of course we often find that there is a summer dip, and there is, in terms of routines, expectations, with a lot of things, not necessarily reading, but you have to go back and revisit the basics and close all those gaps. But with reading, if we've got that big push this half term, and then if we can motivate most of them to build that habit, then hopefully when they come back in September, they're ready to go. But I think shifting the focus onto them now is a great thing to do, and sharing that with the year six teachers, so that they're not, and sharing, using the reports from Reading Plus in September, sharing those with the year six staff, so they're not kind of starting from scratch. It's that communication between the year five and the year six teachers that we really need. So that handover is really smooth, and then they're just continuing and building on that good work.
So just so that, sorry Heather to interrupt, I'm just thinking, just so that's easy for everybody to kind of mentally make a note, are you able to kind of summarize it down to maybe 4 key things that you might suggest that they could look at for the future?
Yeah. So absolutely thinking about something like Reading Plus as an intervention strategy in year five in particular, and there's certainly a big push at the end of year five. Making sure that the specific content domains you're mindful of those, and you think about how you can drip those into whole class reading lessons. Another thing I would really focus on in whole class reading lessons is making best use of collaborative work and mixed ability work, to work together to analyse a question, give them plenty of time to dig deep into a question in an extract. And another thing would be to make sure that within whole class reading, to kind of mix it up and not always just have question, answer, but to be really thinking about activities to engage them, like timed activities. Who can find me a word which means, or find me a word which is like, find me a place in the text where it tells me such and such. playing little games like fastest finger, who can be the first to put their finger on the word, which means the same as such and such. So mixing it up with little starters or activities within whole class reading, which switches them on and really keeps them motivated and focused. So that they really engage with the text, and they're confident skimming and scanning and finding the way around a text as well. And you can do that across a text. So find me a word on this page, which links to something on this page, and it's just having those conversations with them so that they're drawn across a text, but also really narrowing it down and looking at very small extracts in a lot of detail as well, and allowing time for those conversations.
Yeah, brilliant. I think they're really good tips. I can see Sharon. Thank you for your message, Sharon. Sharon says, Heather, we agree with everything being said, particularly the layout of the text and the topics given.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sharon. So we've done the hard bit now. Pupils are through it, and year 6 are kind of going, oh, thank goodness for that. And on to lots of lovely, nice memory building events like camping for a couple of days. So I want to just push forward now to results day and how do you manage that process? What would you normally do in school?
Yeah, we have conversations across our trust about this, because we like to try and make it kind of uniform in terms of how children get the information. So results day, Tuesday, the 9th of July. I mean, we can't do anything about it now. Of course, what it is, it's about how we share that information and make sure that children aren't disheartened, and make sure it's done in a kind of sensitive way as well. So we agree a date. It's usually either on that particular day or the day after. Just we'll kind of agree that, depending if there's anything else going on. Children do receive it in an envelope with a breakdown of what the terminology means and the numbers mean. However, we do also offer drop-in sessions for parents on that same night, so they can have the option of coming in and talking about it. Because if I think back to when my oldest got his, it was my husband who'd picked him up because I was still at work, and he'd opened it, and the numbers didn't really mean anything to him. The numbers, if you're not in education, then it doesn't really tell you a lot when you first glance at it. You really need to look at the breakdown and what it all means. But for some parents, that's quite heavy going. So I think having that
and if they're opening data and it says 99, it sounds brilliant, doesn't it?
It sounds brilliant. I had to say, what does that mean? What do the scale scores mean? If you're not a teacher, if you're not in education, it's very, very confusing. And even what does EXS mean? And you know, it's all very confusing. So having that, a lot of our parents do utilize that, and they do go and have the conversation with the teacher. And what's really nice about that is they can say, if you know, look at the progress you've made when you started year 6, you know, if someone hasn't achieved expected standards, but look how far you've come, that means that you're really ready, you know, you'll be able to access the reading in secondary school. Or if someone's had a wobble and they haven't scored the way you want them to, they can have that conversation with the teacher to say, your attitude's been fantastic, don't worry about it now, we'll move on. So I think it's used in, those conversations can be used in different ways, or to massively celebrate success if someone's, you know, got what they've worked for and they are really able. But it allows that kind of buffer, and a lot of, like I say, a lot of parents like that we've found, and we do have lots of parents turning up, and I think they like to just sit down and have that conversation. It's a way of celebrating the child's achievements from whatever their starting points were, because even if they're, you know, they haven't quite reached age related, they might have made massive gains from their starting points. So that's how we do it. So it's like an open door policy, really.
Yeah, brilliant. I think that sounds like it's managed really, really well. And how do pupils respond to that process?
They seem to really like that, actually. A lot of them seem to enjoy having that time with the teacher and the parent to have their progress celebrated, not in comparison to anybody else, but just on their terms. And there's very much an emphasis on that throughout the year, that the practice tests are used to celebrate personal progress, whether that's someone getting 3 or 4 marks the next time, or someone getting 10 or 12 marks the next time. It's progress from whatever their starting points are, because you find that children actually tend to, from practice sat to practice that, with all the input, do make small steps of progress, or huge steps of progress, and it's for them to recognize themselves and try not to compare to other children, try and make it about them, really. But that seems to work well. So it might be on the actual day, or just the day after.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you for that, Heather. Well, we're pretty much coming to the end of our time now. If you have any questions, please feel free to slip them in the comments box now, and we'll try and answer them really, really quickly. But I just want to mention that if you do want to see Heather in action again, she is going to be speaking at our International Reading Conference, which is on the 11th, 12th and 13th of June. And know that I can see that Abby's put a little message in the chat box, just so you can click on that and book in if you want to see her there. Or if you wanted to hear any more from us, if you want to talk to us again about potentially about Reading Plus, if you've liked what Heather said about how she's used it, please feel free to get in touch with us, and we'd love to hear from you if you have any questions. I'm not seeing any questions pop up in the box now, so I'm going to assume that everyone's happy to move on now, and I'd like to just thank you for your time for joining. There's lots of links in that chat box if there's anything you want to go back to. The video will be put online as well for you to go back to it another time if you want to catch some of those strategies at a later date if you didn't manage to get it all written down. But I'd just like to say thank you for joining. Thank you to Heather for hosting with us. And it's always great to hear some of the insights that she has from her trust in school. So thank you, Heather. Is there anything that you want to say?
Yeah, there was just the one more thing as well, actually, which is linked to Reading Plus, and you're talking about Reading Plus there, that there is also, I know our English leads, I'm going to point them towards the self-evaluation tool for English.
Oh, yes.
Ahead of the next academic year. There is a really useful self-evaluation tool, which we do because it informs our action plans for the year ahead. So I am going to be pointing our English leads at that, just to reflect and think about what we want to put in place for September.
Yeah, so the Deep Dive documentates are really excellent. You don't have to be using Reading Plus to use it at all. You can find it there. Abby has just posted it in the group chat.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant tool for your self-evaluation and preparation for a deep dive with reading. But more than anything, it's an audit yourself around what's working, what needs to change, what evidence do we have. So if you want to look at that, you can, if you click on it, download it and save it before you enter any information, otherwise we'll all be able to see it. But you're free to use that. It's a free resource for you.
Great.
Well, thanks for mentioning that there. Thank you, everybody. Chris, thank you. I can see you just said thank you there. And hopefully we'll see you again next time.
Lovely.
Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.